toward the spring of 1945, it became pretty obvious that the war was ending, and I can't remember exactly whether it was Goldstein, Lieutenant Goldstein, or John Holbert, who came to me one day while I was working on my shift and asked if I would be at all interested in working on the new computer that was being constructed upstairs. So with nothing else looming big in my future at that time, I said I thought that'd be interesting to learn how to do that. And so evidently they had approached about 6 girls who were working in the unit at the time and asked them if they'd be interested in learning this. So there were 6 of us chosen from those who decided they would like to, and we were sent around the first week in June, I suppose, to Aberdeen for a 3-month study of how to operate all the different computing machines that were down there. That is the IBM type card handling machines, because we weren't at all familiar with that type of operation. And so we went down there, we learned how to wire up tabulator boards and how to wire up their automatic relay multipliers, which they had down there. And the 6 of us spent the summer in Aberdeen learning how to operate all the IBM machines. And the reason for this was that the input and the output of the ENIAC was going to be by way of IBM machines. So if we were going to operate the machine, the people in charge figured that we would have to know how to work IBM cards. Well, when we came back that fall this is now in the fall of 1945, the ENIAC was already pretty much constructed. As a matter of fact, all the panels were up. Some of the parts were not quite finished. I think the multiplier dividers, the divider square rooter was not in operation, but otherwise everything else was. And then we were told we had to learn how to operate this machine. Well, how do you go about that? And they, whoever, I guess was somebody from Moore School, I just don't remember just who the person was, gave us a whole stack of blueprints. And these were the wiring diagrams for all the panels. And they said, here, you can figure out how the machine works and then figure out how to program it. Well, this was a little bit hard to do, knowing nothing about anything. So Dr. Burks at that time was one of the people assigned to explain to us how the various parts of the computer worked, how an accumulator worked. Well, once you knew how an accumulator worked, you could pretty well be able to trace the other circuits for yourself and figure this thing out. So we then proceeded to program a trajectory to go onto this machine. And we had barely begun to think that we had enough knowledge of the machine to program a trajectory when we were told that 2 people were coming from Los Alamos to put a problem on the machine, and Fran and I were asked to help these 2 people from Los Alamos to put their problem on the machine. Well, as I understood, I didn't understand it too well at that time, but now I know from things I've learned later that that was Nick Metropolis and Stan Frankel, both from Los Alamos Laboratory, had already been to the Moore School in July at the invitation of Captain Goldstein, and they had worked with Captain and Mrs. Goldstein and had gotten the general idea of how the ENIAC was going to work, and they had programmed their problem, which was supposed to be a top secret problem, and then they had left, gone back to Los Alamos. When they appeared again in about October, I think it was, they had the problem pretty much programmed onto sheets of paper, and we were to help them set up the machine for this. And that was our first real time on the computer itself. We went downstairs into that room, and that was when all the fun began, because no one knew how many bad joints there were and how many bad tubes there were and so on until we actually started testing the machine. Well, John and Press at that time were like mother hens. Oh, they were mother hens, of course they were. They stayed with that computer night and day. And whatever went wrong, they were in there. There were a couple engineers assigned to it to do the work, but they just were completely involved in every aspect of that operation of the computer, not in the problem itself. I'm not even sure that they were told what the problem was, because it was supposedly a top secret problem, but they certainly knew and wanted to know what each little single part of that computer was going to do. And so Fran and I worked. Sometimes I would come in the morning at 7:45 and work until 5 or 6 or 7, and Fran would come in for the evening shift, and she would sometimes work up till 3 a.m. and then on alternate weeks the reverse would happen. So we got to know everybody attached to the Morse School, to the ENIAC project very, very well. And then along Nick and Stan's project, their problem went on in November and December, I think. And then during January, we heard that there was going to be a public demonstration of the ENIAC. And Captain and Mrs. Goldstein were in charge of this public demonstration. So they picked Betty Bardick to work with them in, maybe Betty Holbert, but I'm not quite sure about that, to work with them in working up some demonstration problems. And that demonstration took place in February and was highly successful. It was very good. Well, shortly after that, I think Nick Metropolis came back to work again on his problem, and this time with him came Tony Turkovich from the University of Chicago. And they worked for a few weeks. And they had no sooner left when Dr. Hartree came from England, and I was assigned to work with Dr. Hartree. So Dr. Hartree had been here once before and had had the operation of the machine explained to him, and he had also had evidently some blueprints or some description of the machine before he arrived to put his problem on. So I went over, worked with him, and ironed the bugs out of the setup that he had worked out, and together we set up the machine and started to work Dr. Hartree's problem. And that went on most of the month of July of 1946, we're talking about now. So I had a lot of fun working on that machine. Just absolutely wonderful time. So that fall, when the machine was moved to Aberdeen, I went to Aberdeen with the machine. And I wasn't down there very long when I found out that the mother hen was anxious to see how that machine was getting along. So John would come down to see how they were getting along on that machine.